The man realized he had forgotten his own name without knowing when it had first disappeared. There was no shock, no sudden fear. The awareness arrived quietly, as if a missing word had finally made itself noticeable after a long silence. That morning he stood in front of the mirror. The face staring back at him was not unfamiliar, yet it was not truly known either. There was a weight beneath his eyes, something accumulated over time. His forehead carried an invisible pressure. He tried to say his name out loud. His lips moved. Nothing came. He paused, then dismissed the moment. People forgot words sometimes. Names slipped away, especially in the early hours of the day. But this word did not return. It remained absent, as if it had never existed. He leaned against the sink. The man in the mirror continued to look at him. Their eyes met, and within that gaze was the sensation of standing before a door that had been sealed for a very long time. After a few seconds, the reflection looked away. The silence of the house became noticeable. There was no ticking clock, no distant hum. The walls absorbed sound, as though the house itself was swallowing everything that tried to exist within it. He did not know how long he had lived here. Yet the space did not feel foreign. He walked into the living room. Books filled the shelves, old and worn, their pages yellowed by time. He recognized the languages but felt a resistance toward speaking their titles, as if certain words had been deliberately hidden from him. He picked one up. A symbol was etched into the cover, a circle containing an eye, a thin vertical scar running through its center. His fingers trembled. The symbol stirred something within him, a memory struggling to surface. But the urge to remember faded just as quickly. More than that, he sensed that remembering was not allowed. He placed the book back on the shelf. At the window, a thick fog covered the street. There were no cars, no silhouettes, no movement beyond the slow, deliberate drift of the mist. It felt intentional, almost aware. As he watched, a thought formed in his mind. The fog came early today. The sentence made his chest tighten. To say today there had to be a yesterday. But yesterday did not exist. A dull pressure built inside his head. It was not pain, but it was close enough to be uncomfortable, like unseen fingers pressing against a hidden part of his mind. He neither pulled away nor moved forward. He simply endured it. His phone lay on the table. When he unlocked the screen, the date appeared. The day and month were there. The time moved normally. But the year was missing, as though it had been erased on purpose. His heart began to race. The call history was empty. No messages. No contacts. Only a single alarm remained. Its label read, "Remember." The alarm time had already passed. It had never gone off. He set the phone down slowly. This was not coincidence. The silence in the house shifted. It remained quiet, but heavier now, as if the walls had drawn closer. A whisper stirred within him, a voice that was not his, yet felt disturbingly familiar. If you remember your name, everything will begin. He did not know what would begin. He only knew it would not be something good. Time passed without movement. The clock advanced, yet the feeling stayed the same. Eventually he turned toward the front door. He did not know what waited beyond it, but he felt compelled to go there. Before opening it, he noticed a weight in his pocket. It had not been there before. He reached inside and pulled out a small stone ring, cold to the touch. The same symbol was carved into its surface. The circle, the eye, the scar. Inside the ring, a single word had been engraved. He read it. Pain exploded through his skull, because the word was his name. And it was something he was never meant to remember. That he remained standing in the doorway, the ring pressed tightly in his palm. The pain in his head did not fade all at once. It lingered, pulsing in slow waves, as though his mind were resisting something that wanted to surface. He closed his eyes and waited for the sensation to pass, but waiting accomplished nothing. The pressure stayed, patient and deliberate. The name carved inside the ring refused to settle into meaning. He could read it, recognize its shape, yet it did not attach itself to him. It felt like a name borrowed from another life, one that had ended long before he became aware of it. He slipped the ring back into his pocket, aware that it had already changed something. The front door opened without resistance. Outside, the fog was thicker than before, wrapping itself around the building and dulling every edge. The street stretched forward in both directions, empty and soundless. The houses stood still, their windows dark, as if they were holding their breath. He stepped outside and the door closed behind him with a soft finality that felt permanent. As he walked, the fog parted just enough to guide him forward. He did not choose a direction. His body moved on its own, guided by a familiarity he could not explain. With every step, the pressure in his head shifted, no longer pushing inward but pulling, as if something ahead of him were drawing his thoughts toward it. Fragments began to surface. Not memories but impressions. Stone beneath bare feet. A voice chanting in a language he could almost understand. The smell of smoke and iron. Each fragment vanished before he could examine it, leaving behind a faint unease. He stopped when he reached a structure that did not belong to the street. It stood where a house should have been, but it was older, built of dark stone instead of brick or wood. Time had worn its surface smooth, yet it remained intact, untouched by decay. There were no windows, only a single narrow entrance. He knew this place. The realization was immediate and deeply unsettling. He did not remember coming here before, but recognition settled into his bones. His breathing slowed as he approached the entrance. The fog thinned around the stone, unwilling to cross some invisible boundary. Inside, the air was cooler. The sound of his footsteps echoed, though the space was smaller than it appeared from outside. Symbols covered the walls, carved deeply into the stone. Circles. Lines cut through their centers. The same mark repeated over and over, as if repetition had been the only way to ensure it would not be forgotten. His head throbbed harder. This time the pain carried emotion with it. Fear. Regret. A sense of responsibility so heavy it made his chest tighten. He pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself, and when his fingers touched the carvings, the sensation changed. The stone was warm. A whisper filled the room, low and layered, as though many voices were speaking at once. The words were indistinct, but the meaning was not. They were calling to him. Not by name, but by purpose. He moved deeper into the structure. At its center stood a circular slab of stone, etched with the same symbol, larger and more precise than the rest. The slab was stained darker at its center, as if something had been placed there repeatedly over a very long time. He knew what the slab was for. The knowledge arrived without context, without explanation. It simply existed within him, undeniable. This was where remembering happened, and where forgetting was enforced. A sound broke the silence behind him. He turned, expecting to see another person, but the entrance stood empty. The fog remained outside, pressed against the doorway like a living barrier. The voices grew louder, more insistent now, urging him closer to the slab. His hand moved to his pocket again. The ring seemed heavier than before. When he removed it, the symbol caught the dim light of the chamber and reflected it back in a way that felt wrong, bending it slightly. He hesitated only once before placing the ring onto the center of the stone. The reaction was immediate. The carvings along the walls began to vibrate softly. A low hum filled the chamber, resonating through his body. The pressure in his head intensified, and this time images forced their way through. Not impressions but scenes. He saw himself standing among others, all wearing the same symbol. He felt devotion, fear, and certainty intertwined. He heard his own voice speaking words that sealed something away. A truth too dangerous to remain accessible. A truth that had to be bound to a single mind. His mind. The chamber darkened. The hum deepened. The voices spoke clearly now. You chose this. He staggered backward, breath shallow, heart racing. He had not been a victim of this forgetting. He had been its architect. The ring on the slab began to crack, thin lines spreading across its surface. With each fracture, another memory strained against its restraints. He clutched his head, fighting the pull, knowing instinctively that if the ring shattered completely, there would be no way to return to ignorance. And somewhere deep within him, beneath the fear, another realization took shape. The forgetting was not meant to protect him. It was meant to protect everything else from what he remembered. The chamber did not release him immediately. Even after the voices fell silent, the hum remained, vibrating through the stone and into his bones. He stood frozen, staring at the fractured ring resting on the slab. Each crack seemed to breathe, widening and tightening in a slow rhythm, as if the object itself were alive. He felt it then. Not a memory but a rule. There were limits to what he was allowed to recall at once. The realization did not frighten him as much as it should have. Somewhere beneath the panic, acceptance had already taken root. This was not the first time he had stood here. This was simply the first time he had been allowed to stand here again. He reached out and lifted the ring from the stone. The moment it left the slab, the vibration weakened, though it did not disappear entirely. The cracks stopped spreading, suspended in a fragile balance. He slipped the ring back onto his finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had never belonged anywhere else. The walls responded. The carved symbols along the chamber's interior dimmed, their edges softening. New markings emerged between them, faint at first, then clearer. These were not etched into the stone. They hovered just above it, formed of shadow rather than substance. Images replaced words. He saw a circle of figures standing beneath an open sky. Their faces were hidden, but he knew them. He had known them for a very long time. Each figure wore the same symbol at their throat or hand. Each had once carried a burden similar to his own. They were not gods. They were not priests. They were keepers. The understanding settled heavily within him. The world did not forget dangerous truths by accident. Forgetting was maintained, controlled. passed from one mind to another when necessary, and he had been chosen, or had chosen himself, to carry the most dangerous truth of all, the existence of the circle. The structure around him was not a temple. It was an anchor, one of many, scattered across places where memory thinned and reality weakened. The fog outside was not weather. It was a symptom, a sign that this anchor was failing. A sharp pain cut through his thoughts, more focused than before. This pain carried words with it, forcing them forward. The circle had been breaking long before he woke up without a name. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber. There were signs he had missed before. Hairline fractures in the stone. Symbols partially eroded, their meaning diluted by time. This place was old. Older than the houses that surrounded it. Older than the city itself. And it was no longer sufficient. A sound reached him from beyond the walls. Not the whispering voices from before, but something deeper. A resonance, low and distant, like a vast structure shifting under pressure. He felt it in his chest more than he heard it. Something was pushing back. The knowledge came with terrifying clarity. The truth he had sealed away was not passive. It was not content to remain forgotten. It pressed against the boundaries of thought, searching for cracks. And now that the ring was damaged, those cracks were everywhere. He staggered toward the exit. The moment he crossed the threshold, the fog surged forward, reacting to his presence. It wrapped around his legs, clinging to him with unnatural weight. Each step became an effort. With every movement, fragments sharpened. He remembered the decision. The moment of silence before it was made. The understanding that once the truth was hidden, the world would continue, unaware of how close it had come to collapse. He had accepted the cost. Isolation, erosion of self, endless repetition. The price of being the vessel was not death. It was persistence. The fog thinned suddenly, releasing him. He found himself back on the street, the stone structure already fading into the mist behind him, as if it were retreating from reality. The houses returned to focus, their windows now faintly lit. For the first time since waking, he sensed others. Not nearby, not watching, but connected. Threads stretched outward from his awareness, thin and fragile, reaching toward distant points. Other anchors, other keepers. Some were still intact, some were not, and some had already fallen. The ring tightened around his finger. Heat spread through it, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The pain was sharper now, but it brought clarity with it. If the circle collapsed entirely, forgetting would fail. And if forgetting failed, the truth would not merely be remembered, it would be released. He looked down the street, knowing without knowing why that his path no longer belonged to him alone. The choice he had made long ago was unraveling. Soon he would have to decide whether to reinforce the prison he had built, or finally allow the world to remember what it had been protected from. The street no longer felt empty. The fog still lingered, but it had thinned enough to reveal movement where there should have been none. Curtains shifted behind windows. Lights flickered, then steadied. The world was resuming its shape, unaware of how close it stood to unraveling. He walked forward, guided by the pull in his chest. It was subtle but constant, like gravity tilted slightly off balance. The ring on his finger pulsed with heat, responding to something ahead of him. Each step tightened the sensation, confirming what he already suspected. One of the anchors had failed. The realization carried weight. Anchors did not collapse quietly. When one fell, the forgetting around it weakened, allowing fragments of the sealed truth to bleed into the minds of those nearby. Dreams changed first, then patterns, then behavior. By the time awareness formed, it was already too late to reverse cleanly. He stopped at an intersection where the fog gathered unnaturally thick. The air there felt dense, resistant. He could feel memory pressing against the surface of reality, straining to emerge. This was the fracture point. A man stood at the center of it. He appeared ordinary at first glance. Middle-aged, clean clothes, calm posture. But his eyes were wrong. Not vacant, not wild. They were focused in a way that suggested too much understanding. He stared straight ahead, lips moving silently. Recitation. The man was repeating something under his breath, words too old to belong to any living language. Hearing them triggered a sharp response in his mind. The pressure returned, accompanied by a wave of nausea. He recognized the cadence. It was part of the binding. He approached slowly. The man did not react until he was only a few steps away. Then, abruptly, the recitation stopped. The man turned. "You're late," he said. The voice was steady, certain. As if delay, not presence, was the unexpected factor. "You shouldn't know that," he replied. The man smiled faintly. "I shouldn't know many things." The ring burned hotter. This was not a keeper. This was something else. Someone who had glimpsed the truth without being meant to carry it. A consequence of failure. "What did you see?" he asked. The man hesitated. For a moment, fear surfaced, breaking through the calm. "A pattern," he said. "A cycle. We're not living forward. We're being held in place." The words struck deep. Too accurate. Too close. "You touched the fracture," he said quietly. "I dreamed of a door," the man continued, ignoring him. "It wasn't locked. It was watched. And every time I tried to remember what was behind it, something took it away." The fog thickened around them. The intersection faded, replaced by a sense of enclosure. This was how it began. Exposure leading to obsession. Obsession leading to collapse. He raised his hand, feeling the familiar resistance in his mind. The process of reinforcement was not gentle. It never had been. Memory had to be compressed, folded back into ignorance. "I can stop it," he said. The man laughed softly. "That's what you told yourself before." The statement froze him in place. Before he could respond, the ground vibrated. A deep resonance echoed through the street, identical to the sound he had heard at the anchor. Another fracture was forming. Somewhere else. Or perhaps many. The man's eyes widened. "It's accelerating," he whispered. "You can't hold it all anymore." The ring pulsed violently. Heat surged up his arm, forcing images into his mind. He saw other places, other people waking with the same sense of wrongness. The circle was thinning. The burden was exceeding what a single keeper could contain. He made his decision. Placing his hand on the man's forehead, he spoke the binding aloud. The words tore through him as much as they did through the other mind. The man collapsed instantly, consciousness draining away as the exposed memory folded inward. The fog recoiled. The pressure eased. But the relief was temporary. As he stepped back, breath unsteady, he understood what this moment represented. This was the first fracture he had addressed directly since waking, and it had cost him more than he expected. His reflection caught in a darkened window. For a brief instant, he did not see himself alone. Others stood behind him, their forms faint but unmistakable. The keepers, watching, waiting, some in judgment, some in fear, some already fading. The circle was no longer unified, and soon he would be forced to choose whether to repair it, or let it finally break. The reflections vanished the moment he blinked, leaving only his own image staring back at him. The window showed a man worn thin by weight he could not fully remember choosing. The street behind him was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The collapsed man lay where he had fallen, breathing steadily, already sinking into a manufactured normality. He turned away. Staying longer would invite attention he could not afford. The pull in his chest shifted direction, tightening like a thread being reeled in. Another presence was closer now. Not fractured, not exposed. The keeper. He followed the sensation through streets that slowly regained their shape. Cars passed without noticing him. Voices drifted from open doors. Life continued, oblivious to the strain beneath it. That had always been the point. Normalcy was the greatest shield forgetting could provide. He reached a public square where an old monument stood at its center. The stone was cracked, its inscription eroded beyond recognition. People sat nearby, talking quietly, scrolling through their phones, feeding birds. None of them looked up. A woman stood at the base of the monument. She did not blend in, not because of her appearance, but because of her stillness. While everything around her shifted and moved, she remained anchored, eyes fixed on the damaged stone. The ring cooled instantly, confirming what he already knew. She turned before he spoke. "You felt it too," she said. "Yes," he replied. "It's spreading." She nodded once. There was no surprise in her expression, only exhaustion. "3 anchors failed in the last cycle," she said. "That's not erosion. That's collapse." They stood in silence, the noise of the square passing through them without contact. Being near another keeper was disorienting. The shared awareness created overlap, fragments of her memory brushing against his. He felt landscapes he had never seen, rituals performed beneath different skies. "How many are left?" he asked. She hesitated. "Fewer than we pretend." The answer settled heavily between them. She touched the monument lightly. "This was an anchor once," she said. "One of the first. We thought permanence came from stone." "It never does," he said. Her gaze sharpened. "You remember that?" He did not answer. Remembering was dangerous in proximity. Too much resonance could trigger what they both worked to prevent. "The circle is divided," she continued. "Some believe we should let it go." "And the others?" he asked. "Are trying to hold what can no longer be held." The ring warmed again, responding to tension. "Where do you stand?" he asked. She finally looked at him fully. "I think we made the wrong prison." The word struck deeper than accusation. "It wasn't meant to be a prison," he said. "No," she agreed. It became one. A low vibration rolled beneath their feet, faint but unmistakable. The monument shuddered, shedding a thin layer of dust. Nearby, no one reacted. The forgetting was already compensating, smoothing the disruption before awareness could form. Her jaw tightened. "They're moving," she said. "The ones who want release." "Then we don't have time," he replied. She nodded. "They're calling for a convergence." The term carried weight. A gathering of keepers was rare, dangerous. Shared memory on that scale risked collapse. The circle had always avoided it for that reason. "Where?" he asked. She named a place he felt rather than recognized. Cold. Remote. A site where the boundaries between remembering and being erased were thinnest. He looked back at the square, at the people sitting beneath a monument built to forget its purpose. "If we go," he said, "we may not come back the same." She allowed herself a faint, tired smile. "We haven't been the same for a long time." They stepped away from the monument together. As they walked, the ring pulsed in warning. Not all keepers would be waiting in neutrality. Some would come with intent. An intent, once remembered, was difficult to bind again. He felt it then. A presence at the edge of his awareness. Not a keeper. Not exposed. Something older. Something that had been waiting for the circle to weaken. The truth was no longer just pressing against the door. It was listening. They did not travel by distance alone. The path to the convergence was shaped by alignment rather than geography. Streets thinned into roads, roads into stretches of silence, and silence into something that felt deliberately empty. With every mile, the world grew quieter, as if sound itself were being filtered out. By the time they arrived, night had fully settled. The place stood isolated against the dark, a structure half buried in stone and ice. Once it had been a sanctuary. Now it felt like a wound that never closed. He felt the presence of others before he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows one by one, each carrying the same restrained weight. Some he recognized immediately, their patterns brushing against his awareness like familiar scars. Others felt distant, altered by time or by choices he could sense but not name. No greetings were exchanged. Words were unnecessary. The circle formed naturally, each keeper taking position around the central space. Symbols flickered faintly beneath their feet, briefly visible before sinking back into the ground. The air tightened, heavy with restrained memory. She stood beside him, tension clear in her posture. "It's already here," she murmured. He nodded. He could feel it too. Not within the circle, but around it. The listening presence lingered just beyond perception. Patient and attentive. A man stepped forward from the opposite side. His expression was calm, almost relieved. "We can't continue like this," he said. "The fractures are accelerating. Reinforcement is failing." "We know," someone else replied. "That's why we're here." "No," the man said softly. "You're here to delay. I'm here to end it." A ripple passed through the circle. The ring on his finger flared in response, heat spreading sharply. "You'd break the bindings completely?" she asked. "Yes." The man's gaze swept over them. The truth was never meant to be caged indefinitely. It was meant to be understood. "And what happens when it's remembered?" another keeper demanded. The man hesitated. "Just long enough." That's not our decision anymore. The listening presence reacted. The air shifted, responding to the change in intent. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, bending toward the center. He stepped forward. You don't know what you're inviting. The man met his eyes. I know exactly who sealed it, he said. And I know why you can't let it go. The words cut deep. Recognition flared, unwanted and sharp. The convergence had done what it was never supposed to do. Shared memory was bleeding through. Pain lanced through his skull as images surged forward. A choice made in desperation. A truth too vast, too corrosive, not because it was evil, but because it was incomplete. We weren't protecting the world from destruction, he said quietly. We were protecting it from uncertainty. Silence followed. The listening dark pressed closer, emboldened. It did not speak. It did not need to. Its presence alone was enough to unravel restraint. It fed on the moment between knowing and understanding. The man who had spoken first smiled faintly. Then let it listen, he said. Let it learn. The ground beneath them cracked, thin lines spreading outward from the center of the circle. Symbols flared, then dimmed. The binding strained, reacting to the convergence itself. He felt it then. The truth, no longer sealed, no longer whole, but stirring. Not a monster. Not a god. A pattern. A structure underlying reality that resisted permanence. A force that ensured no single state could last forever. Change made manifest. They had tried to imprison change. And change had waited. The listening dark surged inward, not as an attacker, but as an observer finally allowed to see. Pain tore through the circle as memories collided. Some keepers cried out. Others fell to their knees, overwhelmed by partial recall. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay upright. If it's remembered like this, he said, it will break minds. Then guide it, the man replied, instead of hiding it. The choice pressed in on him, familiar and unbearable. He had made it once before, under different circumstances, with fewer consequences visible. Now there was no forgetting the cost. The ring burned white-hot. Cracks spread along its surface, no longer contained. The circle was failing. And for the first time since the bindings were created, the truth was no longer alone in the dark. It was being heard. The cold air bit into his lungs, though he hardly noticed. His attention was fully consumed by the convergence. The ring throbbed on his finger, each pulse carrying the weight of accumulated choice and memory. Around him, the circle shuddered. Keepers swayed, some collapsing, some standing rigid, but all connected by a fragile lattice of understanding they had barely maintained until now. He turned to the woman beside him. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering light of symbols now erupting along the ground. This isn't a trial anymore, she whispered. It's a reckoning. He nodded, unable to speak. Words would betray him here. He had learned long ago that language could not contain what was emerging. The truth wanted more than words. It wanted recognition, comprehension, witnesses. The man who had first spoken now stood at the center, unflinching. His presence acted as a conduit, drawing threads of memory from the fractured anchors toward him. The listening dark pressed close, brushing against exposed thought like smoke. It did not need eyes, it felt and it knew. He saw himself, not as he was now, but as he had been when the bindings were first established. He saw the moment of choice, the weight of intention pressing against fragile minds. He had been willing to sacrifice understanding for safety, certainty for oblivion. And now that choice returned to him amplified, splintered into countless echoes. A keeper to the side shivered violently, clutching his head. "I can't contain it," the man groaned, collapsing forward. Memory surged into him unfiltered. Faces he did not recognize, languages long dead, rituals he had never performed yet remembered with terrifying clarity. He screamed, a sound swallowed instantly by the dark that pressed in. The woman beside him touched his arm. Her voice was steady despite the chaos. "We can't stop it now. Only guide it. Guide it." The words cut through his fog of panic. To guide meant to engage, to participate in a force he barely understood. To influence a truth that had already begun to shape the world beyond the circle. The man in the center spoke again, eyes blazing. "The circle is insufficient. The bindings fail because we fail. We have underestimated it for centuries. The forgetting was never perfect." The ring flared, white-hot, as if reacting to the revelation. He felt himself drawn toward the center, compelled to step into the path of exposure. He hesitated. To place himself fully within the unfolding truth was dangerous. Minds could fracture, memories could warp, but withdrawal meant letting the pattern surge unchecked. He exhaled sharply, feeling the first twinge of clarity. "I can anchor it," he whispered to no one, yet everyone understood. Anchor, not cage. Recognition, not erasure. If he stepped forward, he could integrate the fragments, not suppress them. The cost would be personal, identity, stability, solitude, but the circle, fragile and fractured, might endure in a new form. He moved. The ring burned brighter, cracking further. The listening dark swirled, no longer merely observing but acknowledging his will. Memory surged toward him like a tide, carrying faces, names, and visions of worlds long forgotten. Pain lanced through him, but he held firm. The truth could not be undone, only balanced. The woman followed silently, her presence steadying the pulse of memory around them. Keepers who could stand watched, tethered by the smallest threads of restraint. Others had already fallen into the tide, swept into partial understanding, lost forever to the weight of what they had once forgotten. At the center, the man who sought release stared at him. "You will change everything," he said. He did not reply. Words were redundant here. He raised his hand, placing it on the center slab beneath the fractured ring. Heat and light pulsed outward. Symbols along the ground shivered. The listening dark recoiled, not in retreat, but in acquiescence. Recognition had begun. For the first time he understood the full scope of the truth. It was not a secret meant to be hidden. It was a pattern meant to be lived, tested, and guided by those willing to bear its burden. The pain in his head sharpened, but clarity broke through. Identity, memory, intention. Everything he thought separated was converging. He felt the boundaries between the circle, the truth, and himself dissolve. The woman placed her hand over his, anchoring the surge, giving it form without restraining it. Together, they breathed life into the circle's new structure, a lattice of comprehension, not suppression. The first fracture had been addressed. The next would follow. But now, at least, the pattern had witnesses. Anchors were no longer silent. The listening dark had learned the sound of intention. And in that moment he realized something undeniable. The circle would never be the same. The air was still now, but not peaceful. Silence pressed against them like a living weight, heavy with anticipation. The circle had changed. The lattice of memory and will stretched taut, shimmering faintly beneath their feet. He felt the pulse of the ring guiding him, a heartbeat older than he could comprehend. She stayed close, sensing his attention shifting. "It's beginning to speak," she whispered. "The source, the origin of everything we've been holding." He looked around. The night seemed to lean inward, as though the darkness itself was listening for the first time. Shapes moved just beyond perception, vague outlines that might have been trees, or statues, or something older, something conscious. He had felt the presence before, distant, pressing against the edges of thought. Now it was close, almost tangible. The man who had first attempted release stepped forward. "You're about to see what none of us were meant to witness," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "The beginning isn't a story. It's a function, a force that shapes forgetting and memory alike." The ring pulsed violently, and a vision struck him with sudden clarity. He saw a vast hall of stone, older than the oldest city he knew, carved into mountains whose peaks were lost in clouds. Symbols floated along the walls, not etched but hovering, alive. Beings moved among them, indistinct yet deliberate, arranging patterns, erasing mistakes, and folding fragments of existence into a lattice. He understood immediately. This was the first circle. Not built but formed. Not created but grown. A living structure to contain knowledge too dangerous to remain fully accessible, even to its own makers. A voice spoke inside his mind, not external, not spoken. It was layered, multiple, as if hundreds of consciousnesses were speaking at once. "We chose the keepers. We chose forgetting. We chose the pain that preserves the whole." The words resonated in him. He saw flashes of those first keepers, their hands lifting fragments of memory, their faces calm and resolute, each understanding that forgetting was protection. But he also saw fear, fear of what would happen if the lattice failed. "She watches," the woman murmured beside him. "The origin is alive." He felt it, a presence beyond time, observing, listening, judging, yet strangely patient. It had waited for centuries for someone to understand, for someone to guide rather than simply seal. He looked at the fractured ring. Its cracks glowed faintly now, as if reflecting the memory of the first circle. Everything he had endured, the erased name, the empty streets, the keepers who fell, was connected to this origin. "You've been chosen," the first man said, voice low but firm. "Not because you are strong, but because you are willing to bear the truth." He clenched his fists, absorbing the weight of revelation. The lattice was not punishment. It was stewardship. Forgetting was not cruelty. It was balance. The air pulsed and the dark responded. The listening presence, once a threat, now seemed to defer, waiting for the pattern to acknowledge itself fully. "The circle does not want hiding anymore," he said aloud. "It wants guidance." The woman nodded, eyes steady. "And we are the conduits." Pain surged as fragments of memory fully integrated. Faces he had never known, languages he had never spoken, rituals older than the hills, each merged, each pressing their truth into him. But this time there was no collapse. This time he held it. He held them. A wind swept through the convergence, lifting the fog outside, revealing the distant horizon. Stars above glimmered like points of conscious observation, each one connected to the lattice in ways he could not yet name. He realized finally that the circle was not just a prison or a pattern. It was a living intelligence. It learned, adapted, waited. And now it had him as its guide. He exhaled slowly. The ring cooled, its glow stabilizing. He had survived the first understanding, but the night was far from over. The origin had revealed itself. Its lessons had begun. And the fractures? They would continue. But now, for the first time, he felt he could face them. Because he knew the circle was not simply something to guard. It was something to awaken. The convergence shivered under the weight of expectation. The keepers who remained upright now formed a taut ring around the center, their faces tight with concentration. The fractured ring burned faintly on his finger, its cracks pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Every pulse carried both warning and guidance. He looked around at the others. Some still trembled from partial exposure, their memories fractured like shattered glass. Others had steadied themselves, their will tempered by necessity. All of them were bound by the same realization. The circle could no longer remain passive. From the shadows, the man who had first sought release stepped forward. His eyes were sharp, clear in a way that contrasted with the weary faces around him. "You think the circle is yours to command," he said, voice calm but carrying the weight of inevitability. "You think you can guide it, but intent shapes everything, and intent can be corruptible." The woman beside him tightened her grip on his arm. "Intent is always shaped," she said. "What matters is choice." He swallowed, feeling the pull of responsibility heavier than ever. Choice. He had been making choices his entire life without understanding their consequences. Now the lattice itself demanded a deliberate decision, to guide or to suppress, to preserve the balance or risk the release of what had been hidden. The man in the center smiled faintly, a grim acknowledgement. "You've learned what the circle is," he said. "But do you understand what it will do if you fail?" The air vibrated, resonating with the unspoken truths of the lattice. He saw flashes of possibilities, memory flooding into minds unprepared, cities unraveling under the weight of ancient knowledge, patterns of civilization bending to a reality few could comprehend. And at the core of it all, the listening presence waited, patient, intelligent, relentless. "I understand," he said, voice steady, "and I accept it." The first man's smile widened slightly, not in approval but in recognition. "Then you will see what comes next." A shadow detached itself from the far side of the ring. It moved with purpose, deliberate, almost human, yet its form flickered like smoke. This was not a keeper, not fully. This was the origin manifesting through intent, responding to the convergence of human will. The circle shifted. Symbols flared beneath their feet, tracing pathways older than memory itself. The listening presence pressed closer, urging understanding, not fear. He stepped forward, raising his hands. The ring pulsed violently. He felt the surge of fractured memories pressing into him, but this time he did not resist. He let them flow, channeling their weight into the lattice, guiding rather than suppressing. The shadow observed, coiling around the circle like water, probing. And then it spoke, not with words but with comprehension, filling the chamber with awareness. You are the vessel, it conveyed, and the balance depends on your intent. He exhaled slowly. The pieces fell into place. The fractures, the keepers, the failed anchors, all had been trials. The circle had not sought to trap him. It had sought to find someone capable of understanding its purpose without fear. I will guide it, he said finally. Not cage it, not erase it, guide it. The shadow recoiled slightly, acknowledging the truth in his choice. Symbols flared once more, brighter, harmonizing with the rhythm of the ring. The lattice breathed around him, alive, learning. The woman placed her hand over his again. Together, they anchored the flow of memory, shaping the tide without halting it. Around them, the keepers steadied. The fractured minds began to stabilize, their awareness aligned to the new pattern. And then he saw it. The first fracture, the listening presence, and the origin, all converging toward understanding. Not domination, not destruction, but recognition. He understood his role fully for the first time. He was not merely a keeper. He was the guide. The conscious conduit for the circle's will, bridging the past and present, protecting memory while allowing it to breathe. The night was still far from over. The lattice was alive, restless, and endless. But at this moment, for the first time, balance felt possible. And he knew the final test was approaching. The circle was no longer merely fragile. It was trembling. The keepers who remained upright shifted uneasily, their presence tethered to threads of memory they barely controlled. The ring burned faintly on his finger, pulsing in sync with the lattice that stretched around them. Every pulse carried both warning and promise. He turned to the woman beside him. Her eyes were steady, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed the depth of her awareness. The fractures are spreading faster than we anticipated, she said softly. It's not just the anchors. It's the intent of every mind in proximity. All of it resonates together. He nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. The lattice had begun to react. The listening presence was not merely observing anymore. It was probing, testing their limits, waiting for any lapse to expand the chaos. A sudden movement caught his attention. From the shadows emerged another keeper, one he had never met. Her expression was neutral, almost serene, but the subtle quiver of her hands betrayed the storm within. She had survived exposure to fragments, yet the strain was evident. The circle is reacting to us, she said. It's aware of fear. It learns from hesitation. He glanced down at the fractured ring. Its cracks flared bright, then dimmed, responding to his own tightening resolve. Fear had no place here, only clarity. And clarity was fleeting. A hum vibrated through the ground beneath them. Symbols etched faintly into the floor shimmered, twisting in response to the converging awareness. Every keeper felt it. The fractures that had been dormant were awakening, small tremors expanding outward. He realized then that this was not just a test of endurance. It was a test of intent. The circle required guidance, not simply presence. To hesitate was to allow the fractures to accelerate. The woman's voice broke through his thoughts. Do you feel that? Something else is coming. He turned slowly, sensing a movement at the edge of perception. A shadow detached itself from the darkness beyond the chamber. It was not a keeper, not fully formed. Its intent was alien yet calculated. The listening presence had manifested in partial form, testing the strength of the lattice before it fully revealed itself. He swallowed, feeling the weight of responsibility tighten around him. Every choice from here would echo through the lattice, shaping the circle in ways no single mind could predict. And somewhere, far beneath the understanding of all present, the first seeds of a revelation stirred. The knowledge that some truths, once glimpsed, could never be contained again. The memory fragments came without warning. Faces he could not place, languages he did not know, and rituals older than the mountains pressed into his mind all at once. He staggered, clutching the ring, feeling the pulse intensify as if warning him that this exposure was different from any before. The woman beside him steadied herself against a nearby stone pillar, her gaze fixed on the shadows that flickered along the walls. "They are more than memories," she said. "They are warnings, echoes of those who failed before us." He realized she was right. The keepers who had collapsed, the anchors that had failed, they were not simply victims of circumstance. Their errors, their inability to withstand exposure, had left imprints. Shadows lingered, feeding off hesitation and doubt, shaping perception, manipulating intent. A sudden shiver ran through the circle. He turned to see the shadow of a keeper who had been lost, flickering in and out of sight, a fragment tethered to the lattice. The presence carried both familiarity and alienation. He recognized its cadence, its rhythm, yet it was distorted, warped by unremembered trauma. "Do you feel it?" the woman asked. "The lattice itself is testing us, trying to see who will falter first." He nodded, understanding instinctively that this was no longer a simple matter of control. Every decision, every hesitation, every moment of doubt strengthened the shadows, empowering the very force they sought to guide. The ground beneath them vibrated subtly, drawing their attention to the ancient symbols embedded in the stone floor. Lines of power stretched outward, unseen threads connecting anchors he had not yet visited, keepers he had not yet met, and the listening presence itself. A whisper filled his mind, not a voice but a thought, layered, ancient, persistent. "The past cannot be erased. The cycle will judge you." He swallowed hard. This was the first time he felt the weight of the circle not as a burden, but as a living entity capable of discernment. The shadows moved again, brushing against the edges of his consciousness. He realized with a sharp clarity, the lattice would no longer allow ignorance. It demanded acknowledgement, confrontation, understanding. And failure was no longer an option. The chamber pulsed with a rhythm older than memory. Every heartbeat, every breath resonated through the lattice. The keepers had formed a fragile unity, tethered by the threads of intention, but the fractures still pulsed beneath the surface, reminding them that balance was temporary. He stood at the center, the fractured ring glowing faintly. The shadows of forgotten keepers flickered along the walls, drawn by the rising intensity. Faces, voices, rituals, all interwoven into a tapestry too vast for a single mind to comprehend. Yet he could feel the shape of it, the pattern beneath the chaos. The woman beside him reached out, her hand resting on the center slab. Together they began to channel the lattice, guiding the flow of memory, absorbing the surges without resisting. It was not containment, it was direction. From the darkness beyond the circle, the first man, the one who had sought release, stepped forward. "The convergence has begun," he said. His eyes glimmered with a strange light. "Do you see now? Every anchor, every keeper, every forgotten fragment, they are all part of a single truth. It cannot be hidden. It can only be understood." He felt the ring pulse violently. Memory surged into him, fragments of lives he had never known, events he had never witnessed, yet all carried the weight of undeniable significance. The lattice responded to him, bending, twisting, forming a structure that was both familiar and alien. The shadows moved closer, no longer threats but observers, measuring intent, learning to anticipate. The circle was alive. It was aware. And it was listening. "The origin," he whispered, understanding at last. "The circle itself, it's conscious." The woman nodded. "It has always been. But now it recognizes you." Pain lanced through him as a vision overtook his mind. He saw the keepers from the earliest cycles, their hands lifting fragments of memory, shaping and guiding. He saw the first fractures, the first listening presences. And he understood. The circle had been waiting for a guide capable of not just preserving but consciously directing its flow. The first man spoke again. "Choice matters now more than ever. Guide it or let the truth scatter uncontrolled. Everything depends on your intent." He exhaled, feeling the weight of millennia pressing against him. The lattice was no longer just a burden, it was a responsibility. To falter now would not only undo the circle, it would unleash the unremembered into the world. And then he made the decision. He let the flow of memory wash through him, absorbing the chaos, shaping it, allowing it to align without resistance. The shadows shimmered and receded, acknowledging his control. The fractures began to stabilize. The keepers who had trembled found their footing again, their awareness anchoring to the lattice like a tide finally held by the moon. The chamber exhaled as if satisfied. The convergence was complete, not perfect, not static, but whole enough to survive. For the first time he realized the truth. The circle did not demand obedience. It demanded understanding. And he had finally begun to comprehend it. The circle pulsed softly beneath his feet, no longer chaotic, yet not entirely calm. It had accepted his guidance, but it was alive, restless, as if anticipating the next move. Every heartbeat, every flicker of light along the symbols in the stone, reminded him of the responsibility he now bore. The woman beside him watched carefully, her expression calm yet taut. "It is not enough to guide it," she said quietly. "You must decide what kind of circle it will become. Preservation or evolution. Stasis or understanding." He looked around at the remaining keepers. Their faces reflected uncertainty, fear, and hope, all intertwined. Every life tethered to the lattice would be affected by his choice. Every anchor, every fragment of memory, every shadow of the forgotten depended on the intent he set now. He felt the ring on his finger pulse violently, almost in urgency. The fractures that had been subdued were stirring again, subtle, insistent. They were asking a question he could not ignore. And he understood the truth. The circle could no longer simply maintain forgetting. To continue the old way was to deny growth, deny comprehension. Yet to release too much would overwhelm the minds of all who were unprepared. He closed his eyes and allowed the flow to enter him, memories colliding, merging, converging. Faces of past keepers, fragments of lost knowledge, the listening presence itself, all pressed into his consciousness. Pain and clarity intertwined, sharpening his focus. When he opened his eyes, he saw the lattice respond. Symbols glimmered, aligning in new formations, threads of memory weaving a pattern that had never existed before. The keepers followed instinctively, reinforcing his guidance, stabilizing the flow without halting it. "This is no longer a prison," he said aloud. "It is a living structure. One that learns, one that adapts, one that remembers without destroying." The woman nodded, understanding his meaning. "And the cost?" she asked. He looked down at the ring. Its cracks glimmered faintly. "My solitude, my mind, my identity," he said. "But it is a choice I accept." From the shadows, the first man watched silently, a faint smile on his face. "Then you are ready," he said. "The circle has awakened. It will never be the same, but neither will you. That is the nature of truth." He felt the lattice settle, its energy shifting into a stable rhythm. The listening presence, once distant and probing, now lingered as a silent observer, acknowledging his decision without interference. The fractures had not disappeared, they had been integrated, balanced within the circle itself. For the first time he understood the weight of continuity. Forgetting was no longer the point. Understanding, adaptation, and guidance were. And he was the conduit. The night outside remained still, but the world beyond the chamber had changed, subtly, imperceptibly. The circle's influence had expanded, touching anchors he had yet to visit, keepers he had yet to meet. And in that expansion he found purpose. He exhaled slowly. The choice had been made. Continuance, not stagnation. Guidance, not suppression. Awareness, not ignorance. The circle was alive. And he was its guide. The chamber was silent now, but alive with quiet energy. The lattice of memory and intention stretched beyond perception, glowing faintly beneath the keeper's feet. Every symbol pulsed in time with the ring on his finger, each heartbeat a reminder of the responsibility he bore. He looked around at the remaining keepers. They were no longer simply observers, they were participants. Each had integrated their experiences, their fragments, their shadows into the new structure of the circle. The fractures had not vanished, but they had been harmonized, woven into a living rhythm. The woman beside him placed a hand on his arm. "It is complete," she said softly. "Not perfect, not unchanging, but alive. It listens, it adapts, and it remembers." He nodded, feeling the weight of centuries settle lightly on his shoulders. The first man who had sought release stood across the chamber, observing. "You've done what few could," he said. "You've guided rather than caged, balanced rather than suppressed. The circle will endure because you chose understanding over fear." The listening presence stirred once, an almost imperceptible ripple through the lattice. It was no longer probing, no longer testing. It had recognized his intent, acknowledged his role. The truth, long hidden, long fragmented, had been awakened, not unleashed but integrated. He raised his hands slowly, feeling the flow of memory, intention, and comprehension move through him. The ring glowed steadily, its cracks now a pattern, a map of the lattice's harmony. Faces of past keepers, echoes of forgotten rituals, and fragments of ancient knowledge shimmered faintly around him, not as threats but as part of the whole. He spoke, his voice calm, carrying over the lattice. The circle is alive. It remembers, it adapts, and it endures. It will no longer be silent, but it will not harm. It will guide, and those who listen will understand. The woman smiled faintly. "And you?" she asked. He looked down at the ring, at the lattice beneath his feet, at the shadows and fragments he now carried within himself. "I am its guide," he said. "Not its master, not its jailer. Its guide. And I will carry it as long as I live." The chamber exhaled softly as if affirming his choice. Outside, the fog that had haunted the city all these cycles began to thin, revealing distant lights and quiet streets. The world had shifted, subtly, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. The shadows of the forgotten faded, integrated into the lattice, leaving only those who had chosen to bear witness. Anchors hummed quietly across the distant world, stabilized and aligned with the awakened circle. The fractures had not vanished, but they had become part of the whole, a reminder that the cycle of forgetting and remembering was eternal. He exhaled, finally at peace with the weight he bore. The circle was alive, conscious, aware, and guided. The listening presence lingered, silent but present, a companion in eternity. And for the first time since waking without a name, he understood his purpose. He had not merely survived. He had ensured that truth, memory, and intention could coexist. The circle had awakened, and through him it would endure.